Hello, everyone. Today I'm honored to have Wil Prakash Fujarczuk joining us from the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office to answer some questions surrounding sexual violence in academia as well as the role of power dynamics. So, thank you, Wil, for joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself as well as discuss some of your role within the SVPRO?
Sure. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Will. I use he, him pronouns. I work in the SVPRO or Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office as the Sexual Violence Prevention Education Coordinator. It's a newer role on campus. So I've been in the role since about February, so just before the pandemic. And we're actually also a newer office on campus. So a lot of folks might not have heard of SVPRO. Um, we have had a sexual violence response coordinator for a few years on campus, and now that role has grown into a small office within the equity and inclusion office so that we can have one full-time person, myself, doing more of the education piece like this. So I do a lot of workshops and trainings with staff, faculty, and students, consultation on issues around sexual violence, and one full-time person, my supervisor, who's able to do that response and intake piece because they are such different roles and they both demand a lot of time. So we're really happy to have grown so that we can better serve the entire McMaster community.
Thank you. So I think before we begin going over some of the questions I have, maybe you could go over what is sexual violence and how does this relate to other more commonly used terms that we see in discourse, such as sexual harassment or sexual assault?
Yeah, great question and great place to start, right? Because I hear a lot of the time people using those terms interchangeably. And I think before we begin discussing any sensitive topic or even non-sensitive topic, we just have to make sure we're on the same page about what it is we're actually even talking about. So sexual violence is a really broad umbrella term. It refers to either sexual acts or acts that target someone's sexuality, gender identity, gender expression. So we might know that as gender-based violence. And that can be physical or psychological in nature. It can be committed, threatened, or attempted against a person. And the underlying key thing there is that there's a lack of consent. And that's what sort of ties all of these terms together, right? Is the lack of consent. So again, sexual violence is our broader term that we're working with. And then sexual assault refers to unwanted, non-consensual sexual activity. So things like unwanted kissing, fondling, sexual grabbing, and then intercourse or rape also falls in as one kind of sexual assault. And sexual assault is a violation of criminal code here in Canada. And then finally, sexual harassment refers to unwelcome comments or conduct that targets someone's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. It can also be sexual solicitation or advance to a person by someone in a position of power over them. Usually, sexual harassment and harassment in general refers to multiple incidents, but it can also be about one incident that meets a certain threshold. And sexual harassment is a violation of human rights code in Ontario.
Thank you. So one thing you also mentioned was consent. I don't think we went over the proper definition or what that was. Could you go further on that?
For sure. So we can talk about consent in so many different ways, but the definition that we use in the sexual violence policy and the Canadian legal definition is voluntary agreement of the complainant to engage in the sexual activity in question. So it also goes on to specify that there's no consent when someone gives consent for the person, when the person's incapable of giving consent, when there's a position of trust or power or authority that's being abused, when the person expresses a lack of agreement, and that can be by either their words or their conduct, or if the person wants to stop. Again, and that can be by words or conduct. So there's a lot, there's a lot of stuff to unpack around consent. And I think it's important that we broaden the conversation to even looking at how we can have a consent practice outside of our sexual lives, and how we can, bring consent into our day-to-day lives. But of course, I know we don't want to just talk about that for forever and ever, but a great model of consent is the Fry's model of consent from Planned Parenthood. And that gets into some things like the F in Fry stands for freely given. So things like blackmail or coercion or pressure to get a yes out of someone, that's not real consent because it needs to be freely given consent. So sometimes we simplify too much, I think, consent. We say, yes means yes and no means no. And I think that's maybe a great, catchy, simple tagline, but what does it look like when a yes is not a freely given yes, right? That's not consent. Or the I in Fry's stands for informed consent. So something like stealthing, right, where one partner removes a condom without the other partner knowing during sex, that's a lack of informed consent. That's not what the person agreed to. So that's sexual assault. So broadening it a bit more, adding a bit more nuance to it from just this like yes, no definition of consent, and really starting to think about, are we creating space where people feel comfortable to say no, where everyone's having genuinely a really great time, and that kind of thing, right? So consent even applies to things like flirting, right? Because that's where if everyone's not having a great time, that's where it can cross the line into sexual harassment. So understanding that we need to, add some nuance. I know I use the word nuanced a lot there, but it's important.
Yeah, I think one thing that really spoke out to me is when you said, like, you can start an interaction with saying, yes, I'm okay with this. And then you always have the ability to change and say, no, this is not something I want to go with. So it's not always just like a one answer sort of thing. You can always change your mind depending on how comfortable you are.
Yes, totally, right? I think there was, I remember seeing an app developed a while ago, which I'm pretty sure was like out of Black Mirror. I think this was also an episode of Black Mirror. It was like this app where you like give consent, and that way it's like before an interaction happens, and it totally misses the point of, like, you can tell it was developed by people who haven't worked in this field at all.
Oh yeah.
Because it needs to be ongoing. That's such an important part of consent, right? So we can, people can talk about what they might want to do together. There needs to be consent immediately before. So just because you've talked about it in the past doesn't mean that there's consent to it. And then it needs to be ongoing. And then even afterwards, let's talk about afterwards and checking in with people. And especially for, relationships that are ongoing, making sure that afterwards everyone felt really great about what happened is also an important part of it, right? So it's more than just like getting the yes. We need to change that to just making sure that everyone feels comfortable to say what they're feeling. And that's actually the goal. So even getting a no is okay. It's hard to deal with a no, and it can feel like rejection, but it's important to learn how to navigate those feelings, right? And learn how to respect that and understand that when people have expressed their no, it's really great to create a space where there's that level of comfort with each other.
Yeah, I definitely don't think the discussion afterwards is talked about nearly enough. And that's also so important, say, if you're planning on having another interaction with that individual in the future. So it allows everyone to like keep their feelings, keep what they believed about the situation in the open. So that's really important. So now that because we're talking about sexual violence in academia and sexual violence in academic context, such as that of a university campus, one important factor to acknowledge is the presence of power dynamics. So could you help us define this term and describe various ways in which students encounter power dynamics in a university campus or university setting?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of, if you just look up, I guess, the definition of power, you get a lot of pretty vague things about maybe influence over people and that kind of thing. And when we're looking at the context of sexual violence, it's important to look at power both between people, like in an individual level, and then also on a societal level. So systemically, we see a lot of oppressions playing out. So sexism and misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, ageism, right? We're seeing a lot of those power dynamics that exist, and those are very real, and those have an influence. And then also there's that interpersonal level. So what's your formal role, right? A supervisor and an employee, or a TA and an undergraduate student, for example. So there's a lot of different ways that power can play out. And it's always important to be mindful of those dynamics, right? So when I gave that definition of sexual harassment, it included the word power in there, right? So the second part of that definition was sexual solicitation or advance to a person by someone in a position of power over the person. And we also saw it come back in our definition of consent, when there's no consent obtained when a position of trust, power, or authority is being abused. So it's really important to be aware of the different power dynamics that are at play. Oftentimes, I think because the word sex is in all of these terms, sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, it's easy to think that they're about sex. But so often we've heard, and it's important to reiterate, that it's about power and control.
Mm-hmm. And even among like the student level, which you would consider there wouldn't be some sort of like power imbalance. When we look at intersectionality as it relates to sexual violence, are certain groups of students differentially susceptible to power dynamics or sexual violence?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a really important framework. And I think more than important, I think it's central to our understanding of sexual violence. So we know that there's already a very gendered dynamic to sexual violence, which most folks are aware of. We know that the vast majority of times it's men who are perpetrating sexual violence. And the vast majority of time it's women on receiving ends, as well as trans and gender nonconforming folks. And then when we go beyond a gendered lens into intersectionality, we see that there are certain groups of people who experience much higher rates of sexual violence. So intersectionality, for those who aren't aware, is a term referring to the intersection, like someone living at the intersection of two marginalized identities. So it's coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She's an activist and scholar in the US. And she realized that we didn't really have a framework to understand the experiences of, for example, Black women at the intersection of sexism and racism, and that those two frameworks alone don't describe what Black women experience, that white women and Black men, while they do face forms of oppression, there's a unique form of oppression that happens at that intersection. So what that looks like is things like for Black girls, let's say, right, what's called the adultification of Black girls, where people see young Black women and Black girls as more adult and more promiscuous and more, more independent, and then that impacts the way that they're able to receive support. It means that a lot of folks don't believe what happened or blame them, right? So we're getting into victim blaming now for what happened. We know in Canada, there's research that shows, for example, women living with disabilities experience twice the rate of violence than women without disabilities. And then you add in another intersecting identity of being lesbian, gay, or bisexual identifying. So women with disabilities who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual experience twice the rate of violence as women living with disabilities who are heterosexual. So you can see how every time we add a layer, it increases the exposure to violence, right? So it's not only an increase of violence, but then it's also, what's the support like? Are people believing those experiences? And so intersectionalities, again, it's a really central framework for understanding how sexual violence plays out and how the folks on the receiving end are able to navigate support.
Mm-hmm. And with How about international students? Say, for example, like compared to domestic students, is there a difference in between how they would be in regards to power dynamics as well as sexual violence?
That's a really great question. So I think first, even like our definition of what is an international student, I mean, we have how maybe if we look at like who pays what in tuition, that's like one way to look at it, right? But some folks might have, you know, gone to school in Canada for just a few years, and then their parents might move back to their home country, and then they're, you know, maybe paying domestic fees because they're Canadian resident, but still new to the Canadian context. So there's a lot of different, right? We know folks live in newcomer families. There's a lot of different ways to be sort of an international student. And I think with each of those, there's different dynamics at play. So there's a lot of things that might go on there. One is, you know, they might not even be aware of what kinds of supports and resources exist. A lot of institutions in Ontario, it's within the past decade that there's specific offices or staff people dedicated to sexual violence prevention or response. So even the shift in Ontario has been quite drastic recently. And so if someone's coming from a country where that's not common, right? Or even maybe another province where like it's not common, coming here, they may not even know that an office like SVPRO exists. So that's one thing. A lot of the times I hear students being concerned about things like immigration status, right? And worried about what are the repercussions for them as victims, which is really heartbreaking, right? So I think there's a lot of different things we could talk about there, but that's definitely an important thing to think about for sure. There's definitely an increase in like vulnerability there, and that vulnerability can then be exploited, right?
Yeah, as well as differences in culture.
I mean, even here, it's still among some families a very taboo topic to talk about this. Right? And then looking at other cultures, as you mentioned, like the way sexual violence has been handled, it might be, you know, that it's treated with a lot of shame and silence, and a lot of the times, people who experience sexual violence blame themselves. And so that might be something that is further ingrained through different cultures. So yeah, that's all part of it.
Thank you. So now that students and McMaster faculty are online for the present and near future, how do power dynamics in relation to sexual violence present itself online? And are there any notable differences?
I think, well, we're seeing things like, let me back up. So I think virtual abuse can take a lot of different forms, right? Harassment, surveillance, impersonation, those can all be really harmful. And the reality, the nature of virtual abuse allows for things like anonymity. It allows for things like, you know, sort of action at a distance where abuse can happen from anywhere. You don't have to be right next to the person for it to happen. Yeah, so, and then even like things like propagation. So when we're looking at like non-consensual sharing of intimate photos, right? And like how through the web things can just propagate and live on in, you know, on the web, can be really, really harmful for folks. So we're seeing different things like that play out. But then there's also the reality of like people being at home and how that's challenging in a whole other way where, you know, maybe you can't access counseling as easily or at all, right? Maybe your counselor is providing virtual support or phone support, but if you're living in a home where, you know, maybe you don't want your roommates or your family to know about those experiences, and it's not a very like large space where you can't get much privacy. So even a Zoom call where it's like, it might get overheard, that can be tough. And folks are just away from their support systems, their friends, chosen family. So there's, you know, the pandemic, I think, is influencing not only the rates of virtual abuse, but then also there's all those other effects of being at home, especially for folks who are queer or trans, who are living with homophobic or transphobic family. That can present a lot of different kinds of harassment for them. So yeah, there's so many not new challenges, but it's exacerbating a lot of,
yeah,
and it's just
amplified.
exactly.
So right now, I know that a lot of McMaster's closed down. Are you guys offering any sort of like on-campus resources, or is there any possibility where students who are dealing with troubles or issues with accessing support online for them to go in person or access any sort of on campus or in the area resources?
So yeah, so we're totally virtual, our office, but we haven't lost any staff, thankfully, in our office. So SVPRO is, so yeah, myself, Will, and then my supervisor, Hagar, who does the response and intake piece. So we're both available. We're both working full time from home. I know things are pretty, pretty like tightly locked and stuff at the university, right? So really it's just, I think, quite essential like research staff and things like that who are available. I know that there's like also limited appointments through Student Wellness Center, but for us, we are 100% virtual, or we're able to also, do things by phone, whatever's easiest. So all that contact information is on our website, which is svpro.mcmaster.ca. So you can find out how to get in touch with myself or my supervisor, Hagar, through our website.
Okay, sounds great. So if a student wanted to actually report an incident of sexual violence, where should they go and what would the process look like? I know you just touched on this a little bit and gave out your information, but could you walk us through some of the steps involved and the process?
Yeah, so I think, I think the process will look different individual to individual. Basically, folks would access, or they'd want to get in touch with Hagar, who is our SVPRO consultant. So you can email svpro@mcmaster.ca, which is our general email, or Hagar's personal email is prahh@mcmaster.ca. And folks would get in touch with her or maybe even give her a call. I don't know her phone number off by heart, but it's on our website. And basically, I think you can go I think it's important to describe the difference between a disclosure and a report. So that's what maybe I'll do.
Okay.
So disclosures are when someone shares information about an experience of sexual violence to anyone in the McMaster community because they want to access support systems, right? So you can make a disclosure to the SVPRO, to Hagar, and that's not necessarily going to lead to a report, but what Hagar can do is explain what different options are available. So she can explain what a university investigation might look like. She can explain what a police investigation and report might entail. And then also explore other support options, right? So that's going to be, again, different person to person. They might want to access medical support through a sexual violence or a sexual assault domestic violence treatment center. They might want to receive accommodations. So we do workplace, academic, and residence accommodations through our office. They might want to access counseling, right? So just getting in touch with Hagar and sharing, as much or as little as you feel comfortable sharing. And then she can sort of explain some of the different options available to folks from there. And then support with sort of ongoing case management based on which pathway or pathways people want to take, right? Some folks might want to access counseling as well as do a report. So there's a lot of different options, and Hagar's there to really explain how the sexual violence policy fits in with what took place and provide the different resources and options available to people.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned disclosure as being sharing with any individual within the campus. Say, for example, they someone were to share with a friend or another peer, how are ways that that individual could actually support the person who shared this information, or in other ways, like direct them to resources?
Great question. So I do have a full 1.5 to 2 hour training. So there's a lot to it, to understanding how to provide support, because a lot of it's based on our understanding of sexual violence. And often we respond guided by a lot of the myths that we hold in our minds about sexual violence that are perpetrated through media, just messages that we've heard growing up a lot that are actually really inaccurate. So I think if I were to distill that training into a few short words, I think I would say it's important to listen more than you speak. It's important to validate. So validation means not asking why questions. Why were you wearing this? Why were you there? Why were you with this person who has a reputation, or any of that, right? It's not about actually, I would say you're not even actually responding to what happened to them per se. You're more responding to how they're presenting to you.
Mm-hmm. Like saying, okay, I hear you, I understand.
Exactly. Right? Like something might have happened to them that you think in your mind is like, oh, well, that's not so bad. What that does is minimize their experience, and it invalidates what they've gone through and what they're going through. And actually a negative response can be really harmful. So instead of thinking what happened to them, was it harmful or not harmful, that's not what it's about. It's about this person is making a very brave decision to share something with me. Clearly they need support. They're asking for some kind of support, even if it's just in the moment, just having someone hear them out, or it might be wanting to be connected to further support. So just validating, saying, yeah, like I understand why you're feeling that way, or saying, I believe you, or it's not your fault, starting to counter some of those messages of things like victim blaming that we hear, because we've all internalized those messages because we've heard them so much growing up. And that includes the people on the receiving end of sexual violence. They might start to internalize those myths and go, you know, what did I do wrong? Was like, maybe I shouldn't have been there at that time, or, you know, those kinds of things. So just validating what they're going through is really important. And then the last thing I would say is knowing your limits. So it's important to know that, like, in that moment, you're not going to solve all their problems. And that's not the point. And that's okay. Right? We're not there. I mean, maybe some people listening to this are therapists, but you're not a therapist, right? Most of us are not therapists. But even a therapist isn't there to solve everyone's problems in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or one conversation, right? Like it's important to just validate and listen, and then present some options, right? Ask how you can support them. So we use this like recognize, respond, refer model. So the recognize piece is stuff like this: educating ourselves, learning more about trauma, learning more about sexual violence myths and realities. The respond piece is about that validation component, telling them that you believe them, understanding how important a good disclosure experience is. And then the refer piece is so central, right? It's like refer them onwards, right? Let them know that pro exists. They might not want to contact us right away, and that's totally fine, right? So just letting them know that there are different options, letting them know about things like WGEN, or the Women and Gender Equity Network on campus, or the Pride Community Center. So there's different peer support services. There's SASHA, which is the Sexual Assault Center of Hamilton area, and they operate a 24-hour support line. So there's a lot of resources listed. Actually, if you go to svpro.mcmaster.ca/resources, or just from the homepage, you click on support and then resources and services, there's tons of more information with phone lines. So we have so many great phone lines in Canada, and in Ontario we have, you know, phone support lines for male survivors, phone support lines for LGBT youth, phone support lines for Indigenous women in Ontario. There's also different services on campus that might be relevant, different services in the community. And we've also got links there, especially knowing that, you know, a lot of folks are tuning in from different time zones. We've got some links to websites that have lists of sexual assault centers across Ontario and across Canada so that folks can find a local center that offers a 24-hour support line. But again, if folks want to get in touch with Hagar, she's able to help find, you know, local resources perhaps, or the best on-campus resources that might fit for that person. And then I also want to really make sure that I don't forget to mention the limits to confidentiality. So if you're receiving a disclosure as a student or staff member or faculty member at MAC, confidentiality is really key, and respecting that person's confidentiality. So you can, you know, if you need help supporting them, you're able to call a phone support line, right? But we want to make sure we're keeping their identity anonymous or confidential. The only times where confidentiality reaches its limit is when it's about safety. So there's a few things where if you're receiving a disclosure as a McMaster community member, you have to bring it forward to us in the SVPRO. And that's if there's a risk of harm. So a risk of harm to self or others or the broader community. So things like, you know, suicidality, for example. If there's an obligation by law, so if the person reporting or disclosing to you is under 16 years of age. And then finally, if there's an obligation by a regulatory body. So regulatory bodies or colleges that oversee professions like social workers, nurses, physicians, teachers, those are all part of regulatory bodies. And those need to be brought forward as well to the SVPRO. Things like TAs and profs, for example, are not part of a college, so those aren't ones where the confidentiality needs to be broken, but we can still just let people know that SVPRO exists, right? Give them the website or email and let them check it out for themselves. Maybe even offer to say, hey, do you want me to, you know, when we're on campus, maybe back one day, offer to like walk to the office with them, those kinds of things, or be on the phone with them while they call. That can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think just making sure the other individual knows you're there is even just a huge step.
So thank you, Wil, for joining us today and answering these questions. I know that I definitely learned a lot, and thank you to the audience for tuning in with us today. If any of you missed any of the information mentioned by Wil during this video, we will be providing links and resources in separate posts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Take care.